Music. What happened in New York initially seemed like a routine music appearance by two globally renowned personalities, but within seconds it developed into a media shock that went far beyond an ordinary red carpet event. The public appearance of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle was not remembered as a glamorous moment, but as a visible sign of a crisis that could no longer be concealed. Cameras were ready, photographers positioned, expectations high. But instead of a controlled performance, an image of distance, tension, and inner disintegration emerged. Prince Harry stepped out of the black SUV without any trace of his former public charm. No gesture of openness, no smile for the audience, no brief eye contact with the waiting cameras. His body tension appeared rigid, his posture defensive, his facial expression closed off. Observers described the appearance as frosty, almost mechanical. This behavior was not interpreted as composure, but as visible pressure that had been building up for weeks. Meghan Markle, on the other hand, presented herself with practiced elegance and the professional poise that has been part of her public persona for years. Her smile was perfect, her movements seemed controlled, almost automatic. But it was precisely this contrast that intensified the impression of an inner rift. A distance existed between the two that no camera image could conceal. Even from a great distance, the tension was palpable, as if it were electrically charging the scene. The moment that changed everything came not from within the inner circle, but from the crowd. A shout cut through the noise of the cameras and the routine flashes of light. The atmosphere shifted abruptly. Prince Harry reacted. He visibly turned his head. His gaze hardened before he regained control of his expression. Observers spoke of a split second in which genuine anger flashed, unfiltered and unplanned. Shortly afterward, a movement followed that was captured by many cameras. Prince Harry reached for Meghan Markle's arm. The gesture wasn't familiar or supportive, but hurried and tense. It was an attempt to leave a situation before it spiraled out of control. This scene became the central image of the evening and was analyzed endlessly on social media and in the press. From that moment on, nothing seemed staged anymore. The carefully prepared choreography fell apart. The steps were no longer synchronized, the body language no longer coordinated. While Meghan Markle continued to try to maintain the facade of a controlled appearance, Prince Harry seemed to have already inwardly switched to retreat mode. His attention was not on the audience, but on ending the situation as quickly as possible. For many observers, this evening was more than an awkward moment. It was interpreted as a public symptom of a deeper crisis. The location further amplified the effect. New York City, a stage for constant publicity, transformed into a stage where private tensions were unintentionally exposed. The city's sirens, the crush of the crowd, and the incessant flashing of cameras lent the event an almost cinematic intensity. The fact that the performance took place within the context of a public engagement intended to address protection and responsibility seemed particularly explosive. This very framework made the visible tension appear contradictory and unsettling. What had been planned as a controlled return to the public became a moment of exposure. The images conveyed not closeness or unity, but rather a sense of being overwhelmed and inner distance. Even during the evening, initial comments began to circulate, describing the performance as a turning point. The narrative of the united team began to crumble. Instead, the image emerged of two individuals who, while standing side by side, were emotionally on separate paths. For an audience accustomed for years to the staging of a modern fairy tale, this break was all the more drastic. In the end, what remained was less a memory of glamour than a feeling of unease. The performance in New York did not mark a new beginning, but rather the start of open questions. Was this merely an isolated slip-up under enormous pressure, or the visible culmination of a crisis that had long since escalated? Was it a moment of being overwhelmed, or the first public sign of a final breakdown? And how long could such tension be hidden from the world? The images from New York derive their power not only from the events themselves, but from what was visible between the movements. Observers focused less on words than on the spacing of gestures and the rhythm of steps. In the world of public appearances, Body language is considered the most honest indicator of inner states. It was precisely here that a discrepancy was revealed, one that could no longer be explained by routine or media experience. Prince Harry moved with striking control, almost stiffly. His shoulders appeared hunched, his arms held close to his body. This behavior is often interpreted in nonverbal analysis as a protective reaction, a sign of inner tension and emotional withdrawal. His gaze barely wandered to the side, seeking neither the audience nor the cameras. Instead, he seemed fixed on the ground in front of him, as if his goal was simply to get through the moment as quickly as possible. Meghan Markle displayed a contrasting pattern. The posture was upright, the movements fluid, the smile constant. But it was precisely this perfection that aroused doubt. Experts in public speaking point out that overly controlled gestures signal less authenticity than natural fluctuations. The smiles appeared with a time delay, sometimes slightly too late for the situation. This minimal offset was enough to give observers the feeling that this wasn't a spontaneous reaction, but a conscious performance. The distance between the two was particularly striking. While public figures in comparable situations often unconsciously seek closeness, here the distance increased step by step. There were no casual touches, brief glances, or synchronized movements. Instead, their walk together seemed like a series of individual decisions, not a coordinated performance. This form of distance was quickly interpreted as symbolic on social media. Another aspect was the reaction to external stimuli. Flashbulbs from the crowd and the general commotion are part and parcel of such appearances. Normally, these disturbances are ignored or masked with practiced composure. In New York, however, subtle cracks emerged. Prince Harry visibly reacted to noises from the crowd. His head turned abruptly. His facial expression changed noticeably for a moment. This brief loss of control was interpreted by many as a sign of emotional distress. The subsequent movement, which was interpreted as a grasp for the arm, reinforced this impression. In body language analysis, the type of touch is considered crucial. Gentle, open gestures signal closeness and support, while quick and firm movements indicate control or an impulse to flee. In this case, the impression of urgency prevailed. The gesture did not appear as a sign of connection, music, but rather as an attempt to end a situation. The timing also played a role. After this moment, the entire dynamic changed. Music. The steps became faster. Eye contact with the surroundings was minimized. Meghan Markle maintained her outward appearance, but her body tension increased. Her shoulders appeared firmer, her movements less relaxed. Observers got the impression that two different strategies were clashing. Withdrawal on the one hand, control on the other. These opposing patterns reinforced each other. The more withdrawn Prince Harry appeared, the more apparent Meghan Markle's efforts to project an image of normalcy became. The result was not a harmonious compromise, but a visible asymmetry. In the media's perception, this very asymmetry became the focus of the reporting. The body language told a story that did not align with the planned narrative. Long-time observers of public appearances have pointed out that such signals rarely occur in isolation. They are much more often seen as the expression of a longer-term internal process. The scenes from New York were therefore interpreted in retrospect, not as a trigger, but as a revelation. What had previously remained behind closed doors was unintentionally thrust into the public eye. In the end, the impression remained of a facade that cracked under pressure. No words were needed to convey this impression. The gestures sufficed. The question now is whether this body language is being misinterpreted as a single snapshot or whether it marks the beginning of a new public narrative. Was this merely the consequence of a single stressful evening, or did the movements and glances reflect a deeper, longer-standing estrangement? And how long can such nonverbal signals be explained away as coincidence before they become the new reality? The events in New York seemed to many like a sudden eruption. But in retrospect, evidence mounted that the real turning point had occurred weeks earlier. Paris increasingly came into focus. What was presented there as a glamorous appearance developed behind the scenes into a moment with lasting explosive potential. Observers described the atmosphere not as euphoric, but as cool, almost distant. Even then, it was noticeable that although Prince Harry and Meghan Markle appeared together, they didn't seem to be on the same emotional level. Paris was considered strategically important. The appearance was meant to demonstrate strength, control, and international relevance. The pictures showed luxurious sets, meticulously coordinated outfits, and perfectly calculated choreography. But it was precisely this perfection that left room for doubt. Behind the glittering surface, observers registered a growing tension. Prince Harry seemed reserved, almost absent, while Meghan Markle was visibly striving to project presence and command attention. A particularly explosive moment, later interpreted as an emotional rupture, was the deliberate staging of an appearance at a location inextricably linked to the death of Princess Diana. This caused internal unrest. While the move was publicly portrayed as symbolic or commemorative, it apparently triggered strong reactions within the couple's private circle. For Prince Harry, this location was not a neutral backdrop, but an emotionally charged space connected to personal loss. Insiders later reported a tense atmosphere following the appearance. The differences were not voiced loudly or publicly, but manifested themselves in reticence and silence. This form of escalation is considered particularly critical in relationships. Instead of open confrontation, a distance emerged that is harder to bridge. In Paris, this not only created a PR opportunity but also exacerbated an internal conflict. In the following weeks, their public persona changed noticeably. Public engagements seemed more routine, but also more stilted. Gestures that had previously been taken for granted disappeared. Interaction became increasingly limited to the bare minimum. Observers described an atmosphere in which every detail was calculated, as if every movement had to be prearranged. Spontaneity was replaced by planning, closeness by functionality. Paris thus retrospectively became the silent trigger for what came to light openly in New York. The appearance there was not the beginning of the crisis, but its visible climax. The internal tension had already been building, fueled by differing perceptions of boundary symbolism and public representation. While Meghan Markle apparently understood the moment as part of a larger narrative, Prince Harry perceived it as a transgression. These opposing perspectives intensified an already fragile dynamic. Public pressure, media expectations, and constant scrutiny left little room for clarification. Instead, roles became entrenched. Meghan Markle increasingly took control of public image, while Prince Harry withdrew inwardly. This imbalance first became apparent in Paris and impossible to ignore in New York. The surrounding community also reacted sensitively. Reports from close circles indicated a shift in mood, dominated by caution and restraint. Decisions were made more quickly, and processes were adjusted more frequently. All of this fueled the impression that a conflict was simmering behind the glittering facade, one that could no longer be ignored. In the overall picture, Paris thus appears less as a glamorous climax and more as a moment of shift, a point at which perceptions diverged and expectations collided. What was publicly portrayed as a strength acted internally as a catalyst for existing tensions. The question now is whether this turning point was still reversible or whether it initiated a development that was inevitably headed for a public rupture. Was Paris the beginning of an irreversible process, or should a different signal have been sent there to prevent the later escalation in New York? After Paris and before New York, signs of an increasingly tense situation mounted behind the scenes. What was sold externally as a strategically planned comeback apparently became, internally, a balancing act between image management and crisis management. The pressure mounted. Deadlines became more tightly scheduled, expectations higher. In this environment, the dynamics noticeably shifted. Decisions seemed more impulsive, processes more frenetic, the atmosphere more controlled. Sources close to him reported that preparations for public appearances were increasingly characterized by caution. Every step seemed weighed, every movement calculated. Instead of naturalness, there was a focus on playing it safe. This pattern is considered a warning sign in the industry. Music. When spontaneity disappears, control takes over. For Meghan Markle, this apparently meant a stronger focus on public image. The performance music had to be perfect, the image had to be right, the narrative couldn't be allowed to falter. Prince Harry, on the other hand, seemed inwardly detached during this period. Observers described a shift in his behavior from active participation to passive presence. He appeared prepared but not involved. His role seemed to be reduced to enduring public moments. In internal processes, he reportedly withdrew more frequently, while others took the lead. This imbalance intensified with each subsequent engagement. Added to this was the growing pressure from the outside. Media, sponsors, and organizers had planned the comeback as a triumph. Failure would not only have meant reputational damage but also financial consequences. In such situations, room for maneuver narrows. Conflicts are not resolved but postponed. This very postponement can exacerbate tensions because it offers no relief. Reports from within the organization described increasing irritability. Minor delays, technical details, or security issues were said to have triggered disproportionate stress. Such reactions are typical of situations in which internal stability is already compromised. External perfection then becomes an obligation, no longer a choice. Every mistake threatens to disrupt the fragile balance. The role of security planning also gained importance. Public appearances were more tightly guarded, routes more precisely defined. These measures, which appear routine from the outside, reinforce the feeling of isolation internally. For Prince Harry, who is already sensitive to public situations, this likely further encouraged his withdrawal. While the spectacle became ever more glamorous, his personal scope for action narrowed. In this climate, different strategies clashed. Meghan Markle relied on perseverance and control to meet expectations. Prince Harry, on the other hand, seemed to be distancing himself internally as a form of self-protection. These opposing approaches didn't lead to compromise, but rather to friction. The more control was established on one side, the stronger the withdrawal on the other. As the event in New York drew nearer, it was seen internally as a test of resilience. A successful appearance was meant to shift the narrative, silence criticism, and signal stability. But it was precisely this heightened tension that made the moment vulnerable. The margin for deviation was minimal, the tolerance for disruption low. In such an environment, a single impulse is enough to destabilize the entire structure. In retrospect, New York therefore appears not as an isolated incident, but as the logical consequence of developments behind the scenes. The evening visibly revealed what had previously been compensated for internally. The facade could no longer hold because it had already been stretched to its limits. The crucial question now is whether this phase was merely a temporary escalation or whether it marked the point at which control could no longer function as a substitute for trust. How long can a public comeback be sustained when the underlying foundation is crumbling? And what happens when the carefully constructed image falls apart faster than planned? With each subsequent public appearance, the impression solidified that something fundamental had shifted. What was once perceived as a joint project now increasingly resembled a mandatory event. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's public appearances lost their former ease and took on the character of a rehearsed routine. Closeness no longer seemed natural but rather manufactured. Emotions appeared not shared, but coordinated. Observers described this phase as a transition from fairy tale to performance. The gestures were correct, the procedures functioned smoothly, but the emotional core was missing. It was precisely this deficiency that became palpable to the public. Public images that had previously radiated connection now conveyed effort. The joint appearance seemed less like an expression of unity and more like the execution of a plan. What was particularly striking was the further divergence in their roles. Meghan Markle visibly assumed the lead in the public sphere. She set the pace, signaled the outcome, and maintained contact with the cameras and the audience. This control provided outward stability but simultaneously reinforced the internal asymmetry. Prince Harry, in these moments, seemed like a companion, not an equal partner. His presence appeared functional but not conducive to shaping the relationship. This dynamic also influenced how those around them perceived the situation. Organizers, producers, and observers whispered about a palpable coldness. The interaction seemed reduced, the interplay minimalist. Where once small gestures sufficed to signal closeness, now only introspection remained. This introspection wasn't replaced by conflict, but by routine. Routine can stabilize, but it can also lead to stagnation. In this case, it seemed to become a mask. Every appearance followed a similar pattern. Every movement was predictable. For a media audience that expects authenticity, this uniformity was disconcerting. Instead of building trust, it fueled speculation. The more controlled the images became, the stronger the suspicion grew that something was being concealed. The concept of the obligatory event gained in importance. Public appearances no longer seemed like opportunities for joint presentation, but rather necessary steps to maintain an image. This feeling was also reflected in body language. Prince Harry often appeared exhausted and emotionally subdued, while Meghan Markle consistently fulfilled her role. This constellation reinforced the impression that the balance had been lost. Added to this was the media feedback. Every analysis, every headline intensified the pressure. Instead of relief, a cycle developed in which appearances were increasingly judged and interpreted. Mistakes were no longer seen as exceptions, but as proof. In such a climate, even a routine performance loses its protective function. The shift from fairy tale to obligation thus became publicly visible. The narrative of partnership gave way to the perception of a pragmatic alliance in the limelight. This shift had consequences for credibility. Music. The public began to question whether the displayed unity still existed or was merely simulated. The more frequently this feeling arose, the more difficult it became to maintain the old narrative. At the end of this section, the realization dawns that performance alone is insufficient. It can provide short-term stabilization, but cannot replace what has been lost in the long run. The question arises: how long can such a construct endure? Is the obligatory performance merely a transitional phase that can be overcome, or does it mark the moment when the public image has been definitively decoupled from the inner state? And what happens when the audience begins to accept precisely this gap as the new truth? Ultimately, the individual observations coalesce into a pattern that is difficult to ignore. The events in Paris, the visible escalation in New York, and the increasing coldness at subsequent performances combine to paint a picture of a relationship that has undergone structural change. The focus is not on a single moment, but rather on a sequence of shifts that gradually became public. What remained behind closed doors for a long time is now part of public perception. The repetition of certain dynamics is striking. Control on one side, withdrawal on the other, outward perfection, inner detachment. These patterns didn't emerge by chance, but intensified with each public appearance. The more the image was controlled, the more apparent the lack of spontaneity became. Observers increasingly interpreted this not as a stress reaction, but as the new normal. For Prince Harry, this development signifies a visible alienation from the role he has embodied for years. The former impulse to actively shape and defend his image seems to have given way to an attitude of endurance. This change is not explosive but quiet. It is precisely this quietness that lends the situation its gravity. While public conflicts generate headlines, quiet withdrawal undermines any form of stability in the long run. Meghan Markle appears in this context as a driving force behind the performance. Her ability to maintain control and meet expectations ensures short-term order. In the long term, however, this strategy exacerbates the imbalances, where leadership becomes dominance and adaptation becomes withdrawal, eliminating any common ground. This asymmetry now shapes public perception more than any single event. The escalation is not loud but precise. Each appearance adds another detail. Each analysis reinforces the impression of an ongoing process. The public begins to see this development not as an exception, but as a trend. This is precisely where the tension lies. Once a narrative is established, it becomes an actor itself. Every gesture is read in the light of this story. The open future remains uncertain. A strategic readjustment, a conscious withdrawal from the public eye, or a further consolidation of current roles are all possibilities. It is also conceivable that the pressure of constant observation will force a decision that has been postponed until now. What is clear, however, is that the existing patterns will not be without consequences. In the end, there is less of a definitive answer than a series of open questions. Is this a phase that can be overcome, or the beginning of a permanent decoupling? Will control continue to serve as a substitute for intimacy, or will space open up for a new dynamic? And how long can a public image be maintained once the public has learned to distinguish between performance and reality? The public appearances of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle have, in recent months, transformed from moments of shared representation into barometers of an inner crisis. The appearance in New York served as a visible culmination point, not the trigger. Even before, particularly in Paris, a shift was becoming apparent, pointing to differing perceptions, priorities, and boundaries. Body language, distance, and timing replaced words as the most important indicators. While Meghan Markle increasingly took control and stabilized the public image, Prince Harry visibly withdrew. This asymmetry shaped not only the appearances themselves but also their media interpretation. A shared narrative became a strained coexistence. Behind the scenes, the pressure intensified. Expectations, security concerns, and economic interests narrowed their room for maneuver. Instead of resolving conflicts, they were swept under the rug. This strategy created short-term order but eroded trust in the long run. The transition from fairy tale to obligatory event became palpable for the public. The recurring patterns point to a process that unfolds not abruptly, but gradually. It is precisely this slowness that makes it so effective. Public perception adapts. Interpretations solidify. What was once considered the exception becomes the expectation. The future remains open. Reorientation, retreat, or further escalation are all possibilities. The only certainty is that the signals sent so far will not be without consequence. The public observes more closely, interprets more subtly, and reacts more sensitively. The crucial question is whether it will be possible to close the resulting gap, or whether the performance will continue while the internal distance widens. Within this tension, it will be decided whether the public image can be rewritten once again, or whether it will ultimately become a reflection of disintegration.